Good afternoon, everyone. So it's 3:05, so time to get started. Great to see this big group here, especially since it's the third day in the afternoon. It's always tough to be in that presentation slot, so happy to see that this topic sparks your interest. And we are happy to tell you more about our open source license policy we have at our organization regarding the use of open source. But before we dive into the details, let me introduce shortly who we are and for which organization we work. Let's see if the technique works. So I'm Jonas from Bogaard. I work at Alliander, which is a distribution system operator here in the Netherlands. We manage electricity grids, gas grids, and heat grids in a large part of the Netherlands, also in Amsterdam. So the lights and the presentation you see here today is made possible through the electricity distributed through our network. And to give an idea of the size of our network, we have about, now the numbers are already a little bit outdated, but we have over 100,000 kilometers of electricity grid, nearly 40 to 50,000 kilometers of gas grid, about 6 million customer connections, and about 10,000 people that work at our organization to make this happen. My role at Alliander is that I'm the open source office lead for our open source program office, so I support our organization and our team with the broader sense of open source. So how do we use open source? How do we stay compliant? That's also an aspect we are going to talk about today. But also how can we enable our developers to contribute to open source, and also how can we make internal projects open source and build a community around them with other organizations to co-innovate and co-create.
Yeah, and like Jonas, I also work in the OSPO, and that's half of my job. The other, I work as a solution architect for the developer platform.
Yeah. So let's dive into the topic of today. So there's many things we can talk about open source and open source policies, but the policy we would like to talk to you about today is the license policy we have for the use of open source software. And you might ask, hey, why is this license policy for the use of open source software important? As you all know, and I probably don't have to explain to you, is that open source plays a critical role in innovation. And it's also very much true for our organization. We use many digital solutions, we create many digital solutions, and open source is an important part of those solutions. It runs on an open source solution to run it in our cloud environments, but we use also a lot of libraries to make those solutions possible. But open source doesn't only come with opportunities, it comes also with responsibilities. And this can be legal responsibilities and compliance responsibilities. And that can be complex, because there's not one open source license. There are many open source licenses, and the one is not the same as the other one. And not every license is an open source license. And this is also an important role we take as OSPO, is helping our organization to create policies for the use of open source, but also create awareness for those policies, and also create and help the organization to learn about these policies and understand them.
So this is a good point to take. Where are we coming from, and why are we presenting this here today? Because we have a history with the open source license policy.
Yeah. So this license policy was one of the first policies we developed in our open source program office when we started in 2020. And the starting point of this policy was not reinventing the wheel. So I still remember, as the day yesterday, I followed the training Fundamentals of Professional Open Source Management from the Linux Foundation. And one of the insights that training gives, it's really helpful to have a policy about open source licenses for the use of open source. And they give also a template which was useful to get started. And that template, together with our experts, Nico included, but also experts from our legal team, was the first start of building this open source policy together. And in the first version, mostly got contains content about the most common open source licenses, like Apache, MIT, Mozilla licenses, but also more the copyleft licenses. And we each review those licenses together with the legal department to argue if they are usable inside the context of Alliander. And also if they are usable without any restrictions, or there are licenses, especially the copyleft, there are special things you have to take into account when using, or are only allowed to use in specific cases. And this first list of reviewed licenses was the basis of our policies. And we also set up a process because we also knew it's impossible to review all the open source licenses at once because there are a lot of them, and not all of them also relevant for Alliander. So we set also a process up for if we counted new licenses used in our organization to add them to the list together with the legal department. And after this, we published the first version of this policy. It became also one of our most visited policies quickly, because we saw, and also in the discussions we had with the developers, there were a lot of questions about open source and open source licenses, and they were happy that there was now a clear answer to which licenses they could use without problems, and which license needed specific attention.
Yeah, and not just, right, we have daughter companies as well, or partnerships. Yeah. And they also said, oh, you have a policy guidance. That's interesting. That is very helpful. Can we leverage that as guidance? So even outside of a direct company, it was of use.
Yeah. But after a while, so we have implemented this policy back in 2020. In the meanwhile, we are in 2025. We also came to an understanding that there are also some challenges in these policies, which we know not all address. So Nico, tell us a little bit more about why we thought we needed a revised version.
Yeah, as you mentioned, we started with a short list, right? The most common language licenses. And then you look through the code base, and because we gain more insight, I mean, the scan tools and the platforms that we have are getting better. We have a better insight. And then you encounter more and more licenses. And you also have the time in the process to review them. And before you know it, this list you had with maybe 10 license groups extends, and you have 20, 30, 40, 50, and then you group them a bit, and you put them in categories, right? Permissive and copyleft, and maybe or there's some in between. So before you know it, this list becomes longer and longer. Combined with the second point is the compliance-driven. As an OSPO, we of course want to be compliant, and the rest of the organization also wants to be compliant. Also because of the legislative push to gain insight in the components that you have. So more and more the development teams were asked, do all your dependencies actually meet the licensing policy? And it's like, oh, and they go over the list and they encounter something new. So the use grew. But also it was important that the license policy was usable to support this process. In that regard, we had developer feedback. You speak to a senior developer who's been in the company for years, and me coming from open source, I assume that everybody knows permissive and copyleft and the basic licenses. But for them it was like acronyms. It's like, oh, MIT, I've seen that before. I just look it up in the list. Oh, it's green, I can use it. But there's no understanding of the base principle of copyleft permissive. What is the general principle of this policy? Also, of course, this has to do with the lack that we have limited automation in place. I mean, we're still working on that to this day, also with the open source community. But in a larger organization, I'd say it's rather complex to automate perfectly. So we still need a good policy that's meant for humans, and it should align with any automation we put into place. And then still, there's nuanced cases where you say, okay, maybe not sure, or just ask us, we want to keep an eye on this, so ask us.
Yeah. And that was one of the reasons early this year that we saw, okay, it's time to update the process, especially a few things we want to address. Nico, you can share a little bit more about those things?
Yeah, so you see some of the things mentioned here. I think in general we want it to be more clear in our policy, and also like a summary that ideally a developer would have one overview, like a one-page overview for the most generic cases that also brings an understanding. I think that's the key here.
Yeah. So one of the things we really tried to achieve in this new version is that we wanted a user-friendly design, so that gives a little bit more context about the key decisions, and it's also future-proof. So it's scalable throughout the organization, and it's also more and more a living document which also develops along the site.
Yeah, and I think one thing I should not step over too fast is the different use cases, because the policy was very flat, right? It was just a list, and then you say, okay, permissive, that's fine. GPL, oh, we're not sure. AGPL, oh no, we don't want to have any AGPL in our company. But then actually when you have insights in what your developers are using, what the infrastructure people are using, then you find, oh, AGPL, well, we have Grafana running in parts of our infrastructure. Yeah, and it's good that they're using open source. We're not modifying it. So what is the actual issue? I mean, it's AGPL, but okay, so I guess there's a use case of something that's standalone, that's running somewhere, that might not be an issue to have AGPL there. Or we have things in the build pipeline that maybe are GPL, but they don't end up in the code that we actually deploy or ship. So maybe we prefer permissive, but it's not directly an issue. And so having this nuance there, I think is also key to allow more open source in the organization in a still controlled manner.
Yeah. So these things we address in the new version. So let's dive into, I think everyone is now curious, how does this new version look and what does it actually consist of? So Nico, tell us a little bit more about the setup. I think let's start a little bit about the introduction.
Yeah, so we're pretty much going out from top to bottom, right? So we added an introduction. We already had something in the previous license policy, which we refined over time. But it also describes a bit of introduction for newcomers to licenses, that it's important to check licenses, that also a license is not the only thing to consider. So if the license is good, then you can use it. No, there's other aspects like, is it under open governance, like LF, or how is it actively maintained? Things like that. And we have a dedicated page to which we refer. Also the scope of the document, right? We are talking about open source use of open source. Means if you procure a license, it could be that you're using the same software, but under different conditions. And we're the OSPO, so we go about open source and not about procured software. That's the procurement department.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think you already mentioned the different use cases of how we use open source is very important, and which is also an important part of this new policy. And you also included that as part of the policies to give a little bit attention on how can open source software be used in Alliander.
Yeah, and because each and every organization is different. When I think of other organizations doing open source, I think of German car manufacturers. Their use of open source is totally different in the sense that they actually ship the software in a car and maybe have to be able to patch software in the future, so they need guarantees that they actually can change it and build it. So they have a different way of dealing with that software compared to maybe their website, right? There's a span of how do you use the software. And in our company, most of the software is for internal use. It's applications or control. It's often dashboards, web apps, which means that we're not distributing software. So that's sort of the general case. So when most of the developers come, copyleft is less of an issue. But then again, still, that's also in the bullets. Sometimes we engage in partnerships, or we want to open source something in the future, or there might be cases in the future. So at the same time, even though copyleft in itself might be fine in the way it's most situations software is used, we still want to keep some flexibility, and therefore are a bit reluctant to adopt copyleft. And I think it's good to be clear to the developers, like, this is why the policy is the way it is.
Yeah. And I think you already talked a little bit that this policy is not about open source license for publishing, and also and not about the criteria, because we have different policies about it. Is there anything else I forgot to mention?
Yeah, it is not about the publishing, right? So we renamed it also the license for use of open source. To be clear, this is only for use, and it is not about publishing, because if you want to publish open source, we also facilitate that, but then we have other licenses, a different policy, and we don't have to go into all the nitty-tiny details of all the various licenses. And so then you end up with this, right? So you have the license categories on the one end, and you have the use cases on the other. And then what do you get? You get a matrix. Yeah, so everybody's taking pictures. Yeah. Of course, the slides are already online, so please, but happy to take the pictures. But this is also on the license policy quite up at the top of the page, because I think this is what should be the one-pager. And it also highlights with the colors, and we go a bit more in depth, what we prefer in green, what is okay still in yellow, what is maybe something we is something we want to keep an eye on, or there could be edge cases in orange, and things that we say no, not at least not as an open source license. That is in red. And of course, the colors could be different for your organization, or you might have different use cases you want to distinguish. We're looking into doing open hardware. There's nothing about open hardware on this matrix yet. Yeah, let's go over it in a bit more detail.
Yeah, so let's dive a little bit more in the license types, which are one side of the matrix. So what kind of license types do we distinguish?
Yeah, so the sort of the typical, right? So permissive, weak, strong, copyleft, network copyleft, because for us it's a relevant distinction. The AGPL has said. Source available is becoming more and more popular and concerning, so we also have that. And then there's a non-commercial, which is actually interesting. I might as well say this here, I think, on this slide. When people learn that actually what you get from Stack Overflow is red, because it's one of the use cases, it triggers developers, right? What? Can I not use this? How does that work? Oh, maybe I should pay attention to the licenses, because right, it's a non-commercial, and even though we're publicly owned, we're still a commercial company.
Yeah. You already mentioned use cases at the other side of the matrix. Which kind of use cases do we distinguish between? Yeah, to keep it simple, we kept it to 4. Code snippet, to be explicit about the Stack Overflow use case, and also to discourage people from copying code. Then we have the general use of using it as a library. And as I already mentioned, things that are just running in the pipeline for software, for building software, deploying software, but is not ending up in the final deployment. And the standalone software application, we don't modify, we don't change. Yeah. Yeah. And Nico, do we also make a distinguish between static and dynamic linking of libraries? Yeah, yeah. In the previous policy, we had something, right? Static linking, dynamic linking, because that's what you learn. That is important distinction, talking about copyleft. Oh. But then looking at the way we use software, as most of it is hosted as a service, like, for most of the developers, it's just confusion. It would not change anything on in our policy, so we can just group it. Might be different again for your organization, but for us, it's like, okay, we don't have to bother them with that. And then you already mentioned the colors. Green, of course, makes sense that it's more preferable, or red, not so much. Can you elaborate a little bit more about the different meaning?
Yeah, so I had an interesting conversation with the legal department about the orange category. The legal department at the time suggested, well, maybe they should ask permission for everything that is not permissive. It's like, do you know that we got about, including versions, we got about 30,000 libraries each month. So how are we going to do this, right? So that will be a big hassle. So we are only we made the decision to only focus on the things that are concerning. There might be edge cases, and we want to keep an eye out. So AGPL, Grafana example might still be fine, but please just contact the OSPO, then we review how are you using it, are you modifying it or not, is it publicly available, things like that. So we can also then register that everything is fine and come back a year to check in again.
Yeah.
And in the matrix there was quite a bit of detail in small text. Just having the use cases, I mean, a developer would understand a library or maybe standalone build tooling, but the license categories will be more difficult. And so we add examples to make it recognizable also. So if you read the policy, then talking with developers, oh yeah, I recognize the software. Oh, it's in that category. Ah, it's good to know, right? They start to hopefully get an understanding of the policy. And we also did it in the boxes in the matrix itself. So not just on the edges, the column and the row headers, but also in the software itself. And the things we highlight here are things we encountered or we know of, which as an OSPO we are repeated offenders, things. There's sometimes libraries popping up as like, no, don't use it. And there's another team that copied it. And so 2 weeks later, you see it popping up there. And it's like, no, don't use it. And it pops up somewhere else. So these are the things you want to highlight in the policy, but also maybe good examples for things like, we prefer to have this database, so this is in the green category, and as a suggestion. So with the examples, it is a way of steering.
Yeah. And then the metrics is not the only part which is still in the policy. So I mentioned, and the first version of the policy was mostly around the overview of the reviewed licenses, and we still have that in also the current version. And can you explain why we kept that?
Yeah. So the previous policy was just a lookup table, right? MIT, oh yeah, it's green. AGPL. I heard I think it was yesterday. We had a discussion that the developers misinterpreted GPL and AGPL, mixing them up, not understanding that the A is actually a very key letter in this case. But yeah, we still keep the list with all the details, so they can actually look it up. And also, it also links to the page where we register the evaluation we did. So when we evaluate a license together with the legal team, we document that. That's available to everybody. So if you want to know more, they can click on it. Yeah.
Yeah, and we also included the same use cases, which was mentioned in the metrics, also in this list. So it's a clear understanding what the policy is for the license for each different use case.
Yeah, so that was an overview of what we did with this whole revision of the license policy, and we iterated with developers, and I think that led us some key conclusions, some lessons learned.
Yeah, so thank you for Nico, especially to bringing us up to speed on the license policy we have at Alliander. And there's also a few lessons learned which we would like to share with you if you're considering updating your license policy, or in case you don't have one and want to build one. There are three things that for us were really essential. So the first one is collaboration. So for us, involving the legal department very early on was key, because this is also very much a legal topic. So getting the legal team in and also supporting the policy was essential. But especially in the revised version, we also learned it was great to learn from the developers that actually use this policy and to learn what worked well for them, what was missing for them, and what could be improved. And when we would start all over again, I would have been involved in them from the start. And the second thing is, it's also good to keep in mind that a policy, and I think that applies for most policies, is not a fixed thing. I think a policy is never finished and should also be iterated based on how it's used, the feedback you achieve, and that's also something we keep in mind, and we'll do that in the future as well. And what we also learned is that I think for us and most people here in the room, open source and open source licensing is something which we know very well, we understand very well. But it's also good to understand that's not the case for everyone. Some people are very new to open source and open source licenses, and it helps to get a little bit extra introduction in why is it important in the first place, and what are the different aspects to take into account, and also provide them with examples to really put it in a place that they recognize. And to give a little bit practical takeaways based on these lessons learned, I would say start simple and scale. So even though also our first version was not perfect, we were still happy that we started with the first version because you can work a year on it and then release it. But we're also happy that we published it very quick. Because it was a starting point for developers to get started, and then based on the first use, we also got the feedback to improve it.
Yeah, and that also got the people to find the page and to get the recurring views of people looking at the page, and now they have the review the new policy on the same page. Yeah,
I already mentioned the involving users, but I want to mention that again. And also, as Nico mentioned, we also have exceptions, right? For example, Grafana is fine to use in particular cases, but it's also really good to be very explicit about those exceptions where you might differ from the policy. And the fourth one, that's one we're still working very hard on it, but I think if you really want to set a step in open source use and tackling compliance, I think automation is key. So I think automating a large part of this policy in your build pipelines is very helpful. And it's definitely also something I recommend. And there are great open source tools out there. There's many, I think, discussed today. So we will not talk about that, but that's also something we are working hard on now. And it's definitely something good to consider. So that brings us to the end, Nico.
So you can contact us here or find our great open source projects.
Yeah. So we also, we didn't talk about that today. We're very active as Alliander in Links Foundation Energy. That's a foundation on the energy domain, where you're active in several projects. If you're interested, you feel free to take a look at the website or reach out to us to find more information. And I think we have a couple minutes left, so if there are some questions, we would love to dive into that.
Yeah, I think I'll just hand out my handout. So.
Okay, did you mention that this was started around 2020? When you actually feel that the process is kind of ready, that people has like just small changes and then people get used to know this project, the entire process?
So I think when we published the first version, it already started to affect in the organization. It created awareness. There was, of course, a lot of developers which were already had some knowledge about open source and know the differences, but it was not that structured. At least this policy gave clearance on which license to use and which not, and also started the discussion, even though it was not perfect, but it already was making impact.
Thank you for the talk. It was super, super useful. My question is, like you have more than 5,000 employees. How do you raise awareness that this policy actually exists and they have to follow it? Do you do any type of training during onboarding or something else so to make sure that actually people know about it?
Yeah, Yeah, I think up front, we have over 5,000 employees, but not all of them work in IT and not all of them are developers. So the number of people that are actually the target audience for the policy is a bit less.
But still quite a few people.
Yeah, and the challenge remains. The challenge remains. How do you get them to know of this? I think we keep on addressing this, right? We have an intranet where we publish also the new revisions, raise awareness, like we update it. This is important. When we give presentations, we often refer to this also at developer meetups. When we interact as an OSPO with teams, it often comes up. And then, yeah, there could be solution architects that talk with us, like more management layer that you address that, and they find it very helpful, and then they relay it to the developers that they're working with. So they are also allies in getting us to comply. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's important to repeat. So it's you of course have to reach out, create awareness when we publish the first version, the second version, but it's also important to repeat it, that people get aware of, and also think about who is the target group of this policy. And as Nico mentioned, one side is developers, but it's also very much solution architects, but also the legal team and the procurement team needs to be aware of. So it's also reaching out to these different target groups. And making sure that they know that it exists in the first place, and also how they can find it, and they can reach out to us if anything is unclear or needs support.
Yeah, and of course, if we find a violation or our automation find any violation, then of course we refer to the policy, but that's always a bit after the fact.
Yeah, I see there's a question from Thomas, or yeah.
Thanks for a great talk. I have a question on the cooperation with the legal department. First off, are you two lawyers?
No, we are not lawyers.
No, okay.
What I can add, though,
yeah?
is that with my years of experience, I actually took a class with IP lawyers, a dedicated master class for open source licenses.
Nice.
And not to poach, but I think I was the smartest in the room because of the practical knowledge I had because of licensing. So, right, we go to the conferences, we know the cases, and that really helps. We know how to ask people in the community for advice. So I'm not a general IP lawyer, but when it comes to open source licenses, I can go quite a stretch.
I totally believe you. So my question is, how did you get the legal department to trust you on these matters?
I think it takes time, but it's great. As Nico mentioned, he is a great expert, and our legal team was actually quite happy that Nico knows so a lot about this topic, and also is helping, and that's something Nico does really great, is if we encounter a new license, the first analysis we do as OSPO, and mostly Nico does as OSPO, is to analyze it. Hey, what are the risks? What does that mean for our organization? And set that out in an easy, short overview, and present that to our legal team in a way that they actually can understand the things. And that will help them. In the end, we cannot set the signature if it's approved or not. That's something the legal team has to do. But we can help them make that decision in a very effectively and advanced time. And that's also very much appreciated over the years, and helped also to build up that trust that they, for open source licenses, really can rely as knowledge center on the OSPO in supporting them to make decisions there.
Yeah, and to make this explicit, then it's not just my advice, but what I often do is relay the advice that other organizations are giving. Or just look at if you use a specific library, what does Debian say? What does Fedora say? There have been lawyers that already reviewed this, something like this. You can refer to this, use that as sort of documentation or a proof, and then we send that to the lawyer as a package. Like, given this and this and this and this, we conclude that this. Do you agree?
Thanks.
As a follow-up on the previous. Maybe I can follow up. So, what you describe, I feel a lot of similarities with the issues that a privacy officer has in organizations like yours. Also, the training of people. Also, it's not fixed lines like yes or no. So do you work together with them? And also they work, of course, very closely with the legal team. So do you have sort of discussions with them? How do you do things? How do you change the organization? Or is it sort of, are you living in a separate world?
We work very closely to our CISO team, which is responsible for security, which has a very close relation to open source. And there I really believe in the community aspect and see how we can create synergies and help each other out. And also in terms of communication. So we have been, particularly with the security team, it's a little bit less about the compliancy, but there's also a link from the compliancy part in the security part is how can we strengthen the communications part, or where we can bundle the message where needed. So that's something we definitely look into and work on. Is there room for improvement? For sure.
So you talked about internal collaboration, but I think what was missing in the slide is actually the external collaboration of actually working the license policy together. So I'm the to-do ambassador. I have been helping Nico behind the scenes whenever he has a question. Whenever I learn from Nico, helps me with the thing. So maybe the policy also, and that's why we're hoping at some point publish your policy, not necessarily the legal conclusions, but the structure and the file or any other stuff. Just publish it so others can use this. Actually would be very useful. What I was also missing in your policy, generated AI, you have code snippets. But code snippets can also be generated by AI now. That's actually the most thing that I see. Like code snippets, copy pasting still happens, especially in C++, but most of it now comes from lovely AIs that just blurt out code snippets all stuff.
Yeah, I think you touched a good point, which we have to include enough for next iteration.
We touched upon open hardware. That's a thing, but AI is like a whole different ballgame. We have to look into how we're going to address this. And with publishing our policy, I think we made an attempt here by presenting as much detail as was sort of, I think feasible, or it was good. Of course, when it comes to policy, every organization should do the policy by themselves, I think, in general. What is interesting, though, is that we have encountered some licenses for which there was nothing in the community in terms of evaluation. And then it would also be interesting to publish that somewhere. And I've not yet found a forum where to easily publish that. Okay, you suggest scan code. Well, somewhere that will also be an opportunity.
Thanks. My question goes in the same direction. I really love the categorization and how you presented it, but I'm wondering if really any company needs to do or should do that on their own, because the categories you have are not so specific, and I'm a bit worried when every company does that and needs to do it and does not have an OSPO, where I'm kind of surprised that you have. It's a lot of work, and most of the time actually it's decided by a developer on its own and says, well, I think this is okay to use this license, but isn't there any general approach or source where people already did that? Because obviously it should be.
Yeah, so OZADL is suggested. OZADL is for license, but also I go to the LDB collector, license database collector. That collects from various different sources what they say about the license. But also, if you go to the SPDX list of licenses, there's two columns: FSF approved, OSI approved. And for the most typical licenses, they have been reviewed. But then again, there's many licenses. When you get into the weeds, that we had after 2 years, we start encountering licenses which were never submitted to OSI, or were never eligible for submitting to OSI, so you have to do the review yourself.
Yeah. And regarding that, the template of policy, one thing stopped to mind, and that is a discussion we can start in the to-go group. And there's a lot of information for OSPOs to get started. And I think there's already some information on this, but maybe we can work together with the community there to extend that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So first of all, thank you for the great talk. I love your categories because they are quite close to the developers. But I would have a question. How do you deal with dependencies in Docker containers, or even just in containers, let's say?
In what regard?
Yeah, I mean you have the different categories. For example, source code copied, tools, libraries, and all the stuff. Which category you would use for dependencies inside a Docker container?
It's a good question. Yeah. I think in general, I would say it will be like the standalone software. It's running. It's not modified. It's not compiled or embedded, unless of course it's dev dependencies. But maybe we should rebrand the name standalone software to also include OS dependencies or the OS layer of a Docker container. But I would consider it in that list.
We should add the name container. The concept of container is something that has something in. Okay, this is misconception that happens everywhere, and then I'm directly affected in our company as well too, because most of people are asking about scanning Docker. That's actually a wrong assumption. We are talking about a container. The concept of container, not even go to the software, is that a place that you put something inside. Means that what we need to scan is the something inside. Has nothing to do about the container itself. So people still think that container is an application. It's not. It's a multiple set of sources that need to be scanned. And that's the reality.
Yeah. Okay. I think we already run out of time, I see. So, yeah. So I want to thank everyone for attending and the great questions, because I think that that's great to have the discussion.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah.